G'day, and welcome to another episode of Tartarian Truthers with your host, Casey and Jojo. And today we're going to be delving into the plethora of fairs and exhibitions that happened all across Australia in the mid to late 1800s.
Yeah, so we know that all around the industrialised world in the same time frame, we had the introduction of world fairs and exhibitions. Most people would have heard of the Crystal Palace, where the Great Exhibition was held in London in 1850, and the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Huge and extravagant affairs where all of these beautiful and most seemingly temporary buildings used to house exhibits and displays were destroyed after the exhibition's completion, usually on purpose, but some also via mysterious fires.
Yeah, but not too many people seem to realise that these exhibitions and world fairs happened in almost every state in Australia too.
Yeah, so it all started with the Perth Exhibition in 1881. Now, this is an exhibition that we only learnt about when we started further research for this episode. And to be honest, we couldn't find too much info on it. But we know that it was a very exciting day from this article that we found on Trove. Listen to this. It is early dawn on this auspicious morning. The city is still hushed in sleep. The atmosphere is cool and the lowering clouds obscure the sun. All is silent, save the crowing of the morning chanticleer and the tinkling bells of the kine rousing in the suburbs. We wend our way towards the centre of the attraction, where in a few hours crowds will congregate to witness the most imposing ceremony that has ever taken place in Western Australia. A few workmen may be seen preparing for the day's labour, and others are walking briskly towards this hive of industry to give a last finishing touch to this great work. The sun has pierced its way through the clouds and cast its rays on the golden ball which surmounts the dome of the building and diffusing a bright light around.
A golden ball that surmounts a dome? Wow, that sounds like a pretty fancy looking building.
Yeah, it does, huh? But how odd that the first exhibition in Australia was in Perth.
Yes, it is very odd, and especially when the organiser, Mr. Jules Joubert, also mentions that Western Australia had a stall at the Paris World Fair in 1878. I mean, what did Perth have to offer the rest of the industrialised world in 1878 when it had only gained its status as a city in 1856? Here's a short excerpt from his speech, also in the same newspaper article found on Trove. It may be well to mention that our attention was first drawn to the capabilities of Western Australia by its exhibits at the Paris Exhibition of 1878. It was mainly owing to what we saw there that we conceived the idea of endeavouring to bring here a number of intelligent traders who we feel convinced will, by their reports, induce others to follow.
Interesting. Now, unfortunately, we can't find any images or photographs from this exhibition, which is also strange as it even had medallions made up for the event with what we think may have been the aforementioned domed building. But wouldn't you like to know what Perth had to offer that was so bloody amazing that it inspired an international exhibition in Perth in 1881 before even our much bigger cities like Sydney or Melbourne, for example?
Yeah, I would, because did you know that Western Australia also had a display at the World Exhibition at the Crystal Palace too?
What? No way.
Yep. So in this article from the Western Australian newspaper titled "A Quirky Looking Back on the Making of Perth," and I noticed this paragraph. Governor Stirling had reached out the hand of desperation and grasped a convict lifeline at the start of the 1850s. At the same time, Queen Victoria was staging her great exhibition of the works of all nations in London's Crystal Palace. All extant colonies including the ugly duckling, WA, had shown up and put on a display.
Very interesting indeed. That just doesn't make sense to me, though.
Strange, huh? Especially since it's not something that is ever really talked about or mentioned in the history books, and there aren't any photos or renderings of it anywhere.
You know what makes sense, though, Jojo? This. We have a little bit of an inkling of what could have been on display, don't we? Wink, wink. Okay, now let's move on and see what was happening in Sydney. In 1870, at the newly established Prince Alfred Park in Surrey Hills, the Sydney Intercolonial Exhibition building was apparently designed and constructed by the City Council for the colonial government to commemorate the centenary of Captain Cook's arrival at Botany Bay. Said to be an ornate example of Victorian Baroque architecture, it was demolished in 1954, less than 85 years after it was first constructed.
But now back to the first exhibition that was ever held in it. And it wasn't an international event, but only held for the different colonies that made up Australia at the time. But quite a fancy building nonetheless.
Yeah, it really is. And while researching this building, we learned for the first time about orange men. So we saw these images showing a demonstration of orange men in the exhibition building, as well as an orange man ball held there too. What are orange men, you ask? Us too. So by doing a little bit of digging, we discovered that the Orange Society came about back in 1795 in Northern Ireland by a disgruntled Schmeishmation, and because the men who created it were well-informed and active Masons, the organisation was formed into lodges on the Masonic model, with a neo-Masonic degree system which included modes of recognition, pass scripts and words. And so it appears that the fundamental difference between members of these orders is that a Schmeishmation professes belief in an all-encompassing God, whereas an Orange man professes belief in a Protestant God and a Protestant God only.
So basically, the Orange Men were another boys' club with possibly shady business going on behind the scenes. Who knows?
Yeah, and by the looks of these images, Jojo, Sydney had a lot of Orange men. Look at them all.
Yeah, look at that ball.
I know.
So extravagant.
Very much so.
So the first international exhibition to be held in Sydney was the Sydney International Exhibition in the Garden Palace in 1879. Now, some of you may have watched Casey's bonus feature on the Sydney Garden Palace from last year. And if you want more detailed info on this exhibition, we highly recommend that you go back and watch that one. Because this building and the exhibition was an absolute cracker, wasn't it, Casey?
It sure was. Built in just 8 months, including the excavation of a large basement area, it also housed Australia's first hydraulic lift. The exhibition ran for only 7 months, but in that time, over 1 million people attended, including a record of 27,000 people in just one day. It contained exhibits from 34 countries, showcasing new inventions, technology, art, and ideologies. A steam-powered tramway was even built to ferry the visitors around the city.
But alas, just 3 years after the exhibition ended, the building burnt down in a mysterious fire, taking with it the 1881 census, colonial era records, land and occupation ownership documents, and many other important artifacts too, all stored in the same location.
It's not suspicious at all, is it?
Not at all. And To this day, nobody knows who or how the fire started. And such a shame. Like, imagine how different Sydney will look today if that incredible building was still standing.
Yeah, indeed. Now for what is probably the most famous and well-known exhibition and building in Australia. So this was the first building, built in 1854. And we don't know how, because as we know from previous episodes, Australia didn't have the manufacturing capabilities to build with glass like this back in the 1850s. But anyway, this one wasn't good enough, so it was later replaced with this one instead. And the first Melbourne International Exhibition was held from 1880 to 1881, with almost 1.5 million people attending during the 6-month time frame. It then hosted the even larger Centennial International Exhibition in 1888, and then the formal opening of the first Parliament of Australia in 1901.
So, a pretty important building, huh? And luckily, it's still standing today because it did have its fair share of scares with the fire and many smaller demolitions over the years. However, the main building, known as the Great Hall, survived. It received restoration throughout the late 1990s, and in 2004, it became the first building in Australia to be awarded UNESCO World Heritage status, being one of the last remaining major 19th century exhibition buildings in the world.
Okay, look, UNESCO heritage statuses really irk me, Jojo. I feel like some of the sites and architecture that gains a UNESCO heritage listing gets a cover story that sticks like glue and can no longer be questioned. We're told the story by the UN, not the most trustworthy of organisations, and that's it. That's what is then put down in the history books for every future generation to learn. It just doesn't sit well with me.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with you there. Anyway, a bit more about this magnificent building before we move on. It was built by a man called David Mitchell in just 18 months. He also built Scott's Church, St. Patrick's Cathedral, and the Masonic Hall on Collins Street, amongst other things. He was also the father of Australia's famed soprano, Dame Nellie Melba, his eldest child. And somebody recently brought to our attention just the other day that she was actually born a he. I know, but that's probably an area that's out of our jurisdiction here on Tartarian Truthers. But who knows? We could go down that rabbit hole in a future episode, maybe.
Okay, let's move on to the next one, shall we?
Oh, wait, hang on, Casey. What are these?
Oh, these. You don't know, Jojo?
No.
They're biscuit shrines, of course. Apparently from the Melbourne International Exhibition.
Oh, wow. They must have really loved their biscuits back then, huh?
Totally. Okay, next. We have the Adelaide Jubilee International Exhibition, which was said to be a celebration of the 50th anniversary of Queen Victoria's ascension to the throne in 1837, but it was also a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the proclamation of South Australia, which occurred around 6 months earlier on the 28th of December in 1886.
So a little late to the party, but fair enough. That seems like cause enough for celebration.
Yeah, so the construction of the building took just 1 year, and apparently it had to be extended during the construction process due to increased interest from exhibitors.
Do you find that odd? That, I think perhaps this building was already there and they merely renovated and added extensions.
Yeah, that definitely sounds plausible knowing what we know.
So inside the buildings, visitors could find ballrooms, theatres, and more than 2,200 displays of objects and materials from 26 different countries. From the exhibition's opening to its conclusion in January of 1888, nearly 800,000 people visited the site.
But sadly, in 1962, the Jubilee exhibition building was demolished, just 77 years after it was built, with only this water fountain in front of Adelaide Arcade in Rundle Mall, all that is left. It once stood at the entrance of the Jubilee exhibition building and was given to the City Council by the state government back in 1908.
But just quickly before we move on, whilst researching the Jubilee exhibition, we came across this little tidbit of information from a newspaper article at the time, the Argus, and it stated this.
Adelaide put on her festival attire today. Flags floated from the public buildings. Business was entirely suspended. The streets were thronged with visitors from far and near, and from an early hour of the morning, there was a steady influx of people. It is believed that the opening of the exhibition will prove the turning point in the future of South Australia, and that a renewal of confidence in the minds of her population will be followed by a renewal of prosperity.
So it was the sentence regarding a renewal of confidence in the minds of her population that piqued our interest, wasn't it, Casey?
Yeah. I mean, I wonder what had happened in such a short period of time to cause such a loss of confidence. And also, it makes it sound like there was prosperity, but now there wasn't any. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. It's a very strange statement to be making at the time of an international exhibition, and what really was happening in South Australia at the time.
Yeah, I guess we'll never know.
Mm.
Alrighty, now let's head down to Tassie, to Launceston to be precise, where a building which they say at the time of its construction was the 11th largest building in the world and cost £14,000 to build. It was built in the early 1890s to house the Tasmanian International Exhibition, which was held in 1891 to 1892. The exhibition ran for 4 months and attracted over 260,000 people.
Now, what I find odd, Casey, is that it was the 11th largest building in the world built in Tasmania, the smallest state of Australia and the most isolated. Yet it was said that the exhibition itself was designed to ease the social misery caused by the depression of the 1880s.
I know, right? Like, let's just build a whopping big building. That ought to cheer everyone up. I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
And this building still stands today. It's called Albert Hall and is obviously no longer the 11th largest building in the world. Not that I think it ever really was, but that's just me.
Yeah, and me. I agree, Jojo. All right, now we're going to stay in Tassie, but we're going to head over to Hobart, the capital city of Tasmania, and the host of yet another Tasmanian international exhibition just 2 years later in 1894 to 1895. Why they thought they needed 2 international exhibitions in the space of 2 years on a tiny little island state, we'll never know. But this one was pretty huge too. They say it took 1 million feet of hardwood to build, and it sprawled across 11 acres. Yet today, there is no sign of Hobart's exhibition building. They say proper foundations were not laid because it was decided that it should be temporary. It is said that the exterior was made out of plaster and concrete, which made it look elegant, and the main building, which contained a concert hall, could hold up to 3,000 people.
Wow. But check out these images we found. Now, all the information that comes with this photo is that it is an image of the Tasmanian International Exhibition buildings. But when you zoom in on it, check this out. This building is absolutely epic. Now, I don't know about you, Casey, but do you think this could have been a star fort back in the day?
I absolutely do, Jojo. Now, we haven't talked about star forts before, so some of our viewers may not know what these are. We do plan to do an episode in the future on Australian star fort sites, but in the meantime, there is lots of online information about these ancient structures, so please do some further research if you're interested.
Definitely. And what makes us think that it may have originally been a star fort was its location. So if it was still standing today, it would be here.
Right on the Derwent River. But now there's nothing there, just a large grassed area looking a little bit like a golf course, hint, hint. And of course, the War Memorial, which is a cenotaph, which they say is an Art Deco reinterpretation of a traditional Egyptian obelisk and was originally erected to commemorate the Tasmanian men who lost their lives in World War I. So a piece of prime real estate there, Jojo, with nothing on it. Makes
Deep
you wonder
breath.
what's underneath. Yeah.
Okay, so we're just going to leave that information there for you to process, because we really did take a drastic digression from the international exhibitions into star forts there. But as we said, we will revisit star forts in the future for sure.
Definitely. Shall we head up to Queensland now, Jojo?
Yes, let's.
Okay, the Queensland International Exhibition opened in Brisbane in 1897, and unfortunately this one was a bit of a dud. It only ran for 3 months and nobody really thought much of it during or afterwards. The building, with its distinctive Byzantine-style turrets, is said to have been built in 1891 as Brisbane's very first exhibition building, with its roof being apparently imported from England. Part of its interior was dedicated to a concert hall in which the lovely Dame Nellie Melba, who we mentioned earlier, performed in on a few occasions. And in 1900, the Queensland Museum moved in until 1987. And now it is the home to the Queensland Youth Orchestras.
So still standing today?
Yep, sure is.
Wow, look at that. Okay, so for our last exhibition, we're going to head back to Western Australia.
Really?
Yes, I know, weird, right? And especially when you see where this one was too. Literally in the middle of nowhere in the Western Australian desert. A little town called Coolgardie hosted the Western Australian International Mining and Industrial Exhibition in 1899.
Now, according to Graham Seal in his blog Grizzly History, The World Fair in the Desert, it was nothing but desert in 1892. 7 years later, Coolgardie was the third largest town in Western Australia. Shops lined the extraordinarily wide main street. There were 7 newspapers, 6 banks, and 2 stock exchanges, schools, theatres, churches, a synagogue, and a mosque for the Afghan Cameleers, who kept the 5,000 or so inhabitants supplied with goods and much of their water. 2 cemeteries held over 1,000 underground residents, while 3 breweries and 26 hotels slaked the prodigious thirst of the miners. In 1896, the railway arrived, and just a few years later, the mother of the Western Australian goldfields hosted a world fair.
A fair that was full of grand balls, orchestras, and entertainments of all kinds, including dancing that was indulged in till after midnight. Over 5,000 people attended on the first day, and more than 60,000 were estimated to have visited by the time it ended almost 3.5 months later.
Wow, what an odd place to have a world fair, huh? It would have been so hot. And where did they get water for all those people? That's a lot of extra water that would have needed to be brought in, because they didn't have their own water supply. So many
questions.
questions.
Both
Jinx.
Jinx. There's so many questions. How did they get out there? And you know what, though? Lo and behold, the Grand Exhibition building burnt down in the 1930s.
Surprise, surprise.
Mm.
So this leads us now to the big question on everyone's lips. Why? Why did we have these extravagant and opulent exhibitions and fairs all over Australia and the rest of the world in the same time period? Could the incredible structures that housed them have already existed and merely been renovated and repurposed, used to reintroduce certain technology back into society, to re-educate the masses on the new world and its new history? I mean, 1851 was symbolic as the peak of the Industrial Revolution. Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Western Europe were all controlled by the British Crown. The so-called hotshots of the industrial age. Were these fairs used as a way to indoctrinate the young generations that survived the last Great Reset, to gain full power and control over their newly gained subjects and ensure that they followed the New World Order?
Is that why not many of these incredible buildings remain, either being destroyed not long after the completion of the exhibitions or mysteriously burning down sometime after? The biggest and most opulent to survive in Australia is now protected by its UNESCO listing, with no more questions being asked about its classical splendour and almost impossible architecture and design.
We like to think of the world's fairs and exhibitions as a beautiful mystery, with one part kept a secret and the other shared with an awestruck public. Bread and circuses, as they say. Which surmounts the dome of the building and diffusing a bright light around.
Casey Attenborough there. Sorry, that was so good. I mean, okay, right, sorry. So, doesn't it? Okay, makes sense, does it? Does it?
Let's just whop a big. Let's whop a big.
In the minds of her population will be followed by a renewal of prosperity.
Bravo!